All right, so I think it's time to start. Clock is 3:15, and I want to welcome you to the first Rafnathing at Náttúrufræðistofnun for the season this fall. And as you may have noticed, this is also the first time that it is done entirely as a webinar. So as you can see, I am sitting in my office, and let's hope the technology works. I should say that after the webinar has finished, you can write questions in the chat, and I will do my best to answer. The first brief introduction of myself. My name is Magnus Göransson, and I am a plant biologist. I am working with plant research, monitoring of habitats in the field, monitoring of red-listed species, and I'm also very interested in use of plant genetic resources and how to best conserve them. And this is a bit the topic of the talk today, actually. So I think we should just jump into it and start talking about why does intraspecific genetic diversity matter? And I'm going to give you examples from a genetic study of Nordic caraway, kúmen, Carum carvi, and mention also some other crop wild relatives. So let's see if this works. I think you should see the presentation in full screen, hopefully. Yes, there we go. So just to give you a brief overview of the presentation, first mention a little bit about genetic diversity. I will introduce the concept of crop wild relatives and what they are. I will talk a little bit about the plant that we have studied, caraway, kúmen. Mention how written sources have said that it was introduced to Iceland. And then I'm going to introduce the study that we published this spring about genetic diversity in Nordic caraway. So first, to mention genetic diversity, it's mentioned in the Convention of Biological Diversity that genetic diversity is critical for the long-term stability, adaptability, and resilience of biodiversity, both at the species and ecosystem levels, and it supports the continued provision of nature's contributions to people. So it is crucial for our survival as well, and our well-being. Just to mention here different levels of genetic diversity, from functional genetics on a gene level to genetics of individuals, from individuals to populations within and between population diversity, diversity between species, and then diversity within and between ecosystems. And today's talk is going to focus on genetic diversity within and between populations. I consciously chose a picture here showing fish, and this is to illustrate that these concepts are usually general, so they can be transferred and are usually following between different organisms. So why does genetic diversity in populations matter? So if we have an example of high genetic diversity here, illustrated by many different colors in the school of fish, we can assume that they have quite high adaptive capacity. That means they can evolve and adapt to new conditions. They can respond to natural selection pressures. And this is good for the potential for long-term survival, and this gives resilience to changes in the environment. If, on the other hand, we have a population with low genetic diversity, we assume they have a much lower adaptive capacity, they have a weak potential for long-term survival, and a low resilience towards changes in their environment. So if we look more on the Nordic level region, genetic diversity within species, we want, as I mentioned, as high genetic diversity within and between populations as possible. But different populations will contain different genetic variants. And this is because we always have this selection pressure from the local environment that makes populations adapt by this natural selection pressure. They get adapted to the local environments, and this differentiates between different populations in different environments. And also in the Nordic region, we are a little bit special because we have quite a short history since the last glacial period. Some 12,000 years ago, the ice was withdrawing from our region of the world, and we have different recolonization ways. One from sort of southwest up into Scandinavia, another one from sort of the east into Scandinavia. And then, of course, Iceland is isolated, as we all know. It's an island far away from other land masses. So here, plant species they rely on other ways of dispersal. It can be wind, it can be streams and currents, it can be birds, and it can be humans that bring plants to Iceland. And recent studies that made the news actually this week from Surtsey that showed and highlighted that particularly migrating birds play a major role, maybe bigger than we expected, to bringing new species into islands that are isolated. Also, in our region, we have light conditions. We are far up north, we have long days, and these light conditions vary in a latitudinal way across the Nordic countries. So we expect different adaptations in the different region. And we need to preserve as highly variant populations as possible to capture different parts of this genetic diversity of each species. So why does it matter, sort of on a temporal scale? Well, on the short term, we want to avoid inbreeding in species and inbreeding depression. This is never good. This causes a lower viability and stunted growth in plants and so forth. On the longer term, we want to enable the evolution to progress, and especially adaptation to new environments, new conditions are very important these days when we do have a climate that is changing. So plants need to adapt to new climate where they grow. They may also need to relocate to new environments and thereby adapt to those conditions. We also expect new pests and diseases to come into our region, and the plants need to adapt to that. But also for us humans, we can utilize the genetic diversity for agriculture, for medicinal research, and for that, there is a special term that I will introduce, these crop wild relatives. In Icelandic, they have this beautiful name of erfðalindir, and erfðalind means in English a spring of genetic variation. And just a very classical example of this spring of genetic variation, we can find the wild cabbage plant, Brassica oleracea, one species that is growing in the western part of Europe. It doesn't grow in Iceland, but it grows along the Atlantic coast in France, in Spain. And for hundreds and thousands of years, humans have gone to this spring of genetic variation, that is the actual species, selected different traits in the same plant, either the leaves for cabbage, either the buds for Brussels sprouts, or the stem in kohlrabi. Again, different types of leaves in kale. Actually, the buds of the flower is in broccoli, and then the flower itself gave us cauliflower. So this is a classical example of a crop wild relative. And why are they important? That is because they are so closely related to a cultivated crop that the traits that they have can be transferred into the crops. And they can contain traits that we need in these changing times. With climate change, we may need new adaptations to stresses that we didn't have before. It can be drought or heat stress, adaptation to extreme weather, flooding, frost, and resistance to new pests and diseases, and not least, as I mentioned, the photoperiod adaptation that is unique up here in the north. So here on this picture, you see on the left side the wild carrot that is growing wild in Scandinavia. It doesn't grow in Iceland, but it grows in Sweden, in Denmark and Norway. And then you see the result of human selection, where we have this starchy, sweet root that we know as carrot. Few examples of crop wild relatives. Villtra erfðalindir from Iceland. You have the most grown forage grass in Iceland and in the Nordic region is Timothy, vallafoxgrass. Two wild species, or actually one wild species and one naturalized species, are considered crop wild relatives in Iceland. That is the fjallafoxgrass, this smaller version, and then we have naturalized populations of vallafoxgrass growing in Icelandic nature. These are also considered crop wild relatives. Other examples are relatives to wheat, which is a major global crop. We have bláhveiti, Elaemus cronensis, rather rare grass species growing up north in Iceland. We have a very common grass, melgresi, growing around most of Iceland. Both of them are closely enough related to wheat that they can be used, and we can incorporate new traits into wheat if we need. So do we have any recent examples where wild species from the Nordic countries have contributed to global crops? Yes, we do. I haven't found any example from Iceland yet. I believe we will see this in the coming years because there is a lot of things going on. But I will mention 3 examples. One from Sweden, where breeders of lettuce that we used in between our sandwiches, they need regularly to find new resistance genes to a major disease called downy mildew, and they have found that populations from Sweden usually have these resistance genes and different variants of this gene. So they regularly incorporate new variants, and then there is a co-evolution with the pathogen. So the pathogen eventually wins over the resistance gene, and then you need a new resistance genes. So this is an ongoing game of likelihood as a plant breeder. Then we have a major crop, sugar beet, where wild sea beet from Denmark were found to have resistance to a virus that affects sugar beet on a global scale. So this was very good news for us who like sweets. And then another example from Norway, where actually one of these winter hardy white clover cultivars is on the market in Iceland. It's called Nordstar. And those varieties were developed from wild populations of wild clover growing in Norway. And why is this work with crop wild relatives of special urgency now, you may ask? That is because of what is happening. And to explain why, we need to step back some 12,000 years or so, when humans started crop domestication, when we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. This happened about 12,000 years ago in several parts of the world, approximately the same time. People started cultivating wild species, and through thousands of years, they made selections, bigger seeds that didn't fall off the plant when they were mature, so you can bring them home and harvest, bigger roots, better flavor, etc., resulting in the modern varieties that we cultivate today. But what is important to bear in mind is that this is the global temperature, the last 24,000 years since the peak of last glaciation. And as you can see, somewhere around here, we start cultivating crops. And since then, the climate has been historically very, very stable and predictable. And this is important because that allowed us to select crops that we could predict their needs and breed for those needs. But now we're entering a phase where temperature is rising. This is not the prediction, this is the actual temperature, and it is projected to actually increase much more than this the coming decades. So we're entering a period now in the world where we do not have this predictability and stability of the climate. What this did with the human population, since this is 12,000 years ago, when we started growing plants, we were about 4 million people in the world, and these people expanded slowly on a growth rate until modern science, modern plant breeding brought us up to a bit more than 8 billion people that we are today. So this is a seemingly endless growth. Predictions show, though, that it will flatten out, so we are not in that much trouble as it seems. But maybe somewhere along this endless growth, we might even have lost a bit of our connection to nature. And I think we need to reclaim that one. So now we are in a situation where yields will stop increasing the way they have historically. And they are even likely to decrease because of this extreme climate that we are heading into. And that means we need access to broader genetic diversity for these adaptive traits. And that means we need to step back in looking for these different traits that we have not in our modern crops. And maybe we need to go back to land races, maybe we need to go back to wild species if we still have them. And that is where this crop wild relative project comes in. It's led by Nordic. I will explain what Nordic is. It has been going on for 9 years until last year, and it has brought together these environmental and agricultural stakeholders, making it very interesting discussions. It's been funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers Program for Nature-Based Solutions. So short, just one slide about Nordic. Maybe not everyone knows what it is. It stands for Nordic Genetic Resource Center, and it's our regional gene bank. And it's owned by the 5 Nordic countries, and it's financed via these Nordic Council of Ministers. And Nordic has the mandate to conserve genetic resources of relevance for agriculture of Nordic origin or relevance. They have about 33,000 different seed accessions, seed samples. About 20% of those are wild species. You may have seen a picture of this. This is a Svalbard global seed vault. This is also managed by Nordic. And what is nice with this is that these 33,000 accessions are available to order for research, for breeding, and you can just visit their homepage and order if you can show that they will be used for research or breeding. So this is an enormous resource that we can use for future adaptation of our agriculture. Within these 9 years, we've done a lot of activities. We made a priority list of crop wild relative species to have specific focus species. We've done inventories in protected areas, and we've done climate change modeling of future species distributions. We made genetic diversity studies, seed collections, and outreach. And today I'm going to talk about these genetic diversity studies. So these studies are led by Jenny Hagenblad and Bernardo de Haro Reis at Linköping University in Sweden. And this is work in progress. We selected 4 model species from the Nordic region. 3 of them grow in Iceland. It's lingonberry, rauðberjalyng, meadow fescue, hávingull, and kúmen, caraway. And the idea was to study diversity within and between populations from the whole Nordic region. And only one of them is done and published, and that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. That is the caraway. So, to mention a little bit about the plant, it grows wild across Europe, Asia, North Africa. It's also been introduced in North America and New Zealand. And it's been cultivated for a very long time. And you can often see it growing along gravel roadsides. So it was actually more common in the past. Nowadays, we like asphalt on our roads. And the caraway doesn't like the asphalt. So it is actually a little bit pushed away by this. So if you have gravel roads, take a look. Maybe there will be caraway growing in the roadside. For example, here in Reykjavik, you can find big populations out on Viðey, in the sea outside Reykjavik, and you can see it exactly growing by the gravel roadside there. And it's one of the most important spice crops worldwide, and for us in the Nordic, it's especially important, I would say. We use it a lot, both in bread, cheese, and not least in aquavit, which is kind of our signature drink here up in the north. We use it for flavoring of food and beverages, but it's also been used historically as a medicinal herb. It has some antibacterial properties, and it's often used in soups, such as goulash, for example. And it has been said to milden the production of gases in the belly. So that might be something that is useful, actually. And in the old days, it was even used to brush teeth, it is said. So many uses of this herb. What is making it interesting up here in the north is also that Finland is a major global supplier. So currently between 20 and 30% of the global market for caraway is grown in Finland. So maybe there are opportunities also here in Iceland, who knows? We do need new varieties of caraway tolerant to new climate stressors. Now to the historical records of introduction to Iceland. The Ferðabók, this travel diary of Eggert and Bjarna that was published 1772, mentions the introduction of caraway to Iceland, and they say it was introduced by Gísli Magnússon, who is known in Iceland as Vísi-Gísli. He lived in the 17th century, and he was a pioneer of agriculture in Iceland. For example, he introduced the potato to Iceland. So Vísi-Gísli went, when he was young, he went to study in Denmark, in the Netherlands, and he did some travels in England as well. And after these studies, he returned and he settled in Hlíðarendi, in Fljótshlíð. And Eggert and Bjarna, they state that he brought caraway with him and planted it at his farm in Hlíðarendi, in Fljótshlíð, and from there it should have spread around the country. And of course, the aquavit, we have an Icelandic aquavit called Vísi-Gísli. This is rather recent. It can be found in the tax-free store in the airport, I think. But of course, the most prominent, the most sold aquavit in Iceland, I think, is brennivin, and that is spiced by caraway. So we need it. Now to the study. So it was published this spring, a joint Nordic study on the genetic diversity in Nordic populations of caraway. So what we did was we went out in the Nordic countries to sample different populations covering quite a big geographic area in Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Åland Islands here, and Denmark. And these samplings were done in natural land or in semi-natural sites, pastures, grasslands, roadsides, protected and non-protected areas. We simply took, as shown in this picture, leaves from individual plants, sampled and stored in silica gel. And then these samples were genotyped, up to 20 individuals per population. DNA was extracted, and they were sent for high-throughput sequencing. In all, 198 individual samples were sent for sequencing. And then we wanted to know how is the genetic diversity in these species distributed. We wanted to know the level of polymorphism between the populations. We wanted to know the level of inbreeding, because if you have inbreeding in the population, it's not so relevant for long-term conservation. We know it is less likely to have this adaptive ability. So we want to find populations with low level of inbreeding. Then we also wanted to see if there is a geographical pattern in the genetic diversity. Is there a longitudinal pattern, traces from this recolonization after the last glacial period? Or is there a latitudinal pattern? Maybe there is less diversity up in the north due to a harder natural selection pressure. So we wanted to do geographic structuring of genetic diversity. So here is a terrible table. I'm not going to go into any details here. Don't worry. But what we see here is the HE is the within population diversity. And what we found here is that the genetic diversity is not longitudinal, it is not latitudinal, there was not less diversity in the north. It was basically similar across the area. There was one exception, and that was the Danish population from Selsø, which had a lower within population diversity. And then I mentioned the levels of inbreeding is important. The FIS is the inbreeding coefficient, and here the rule is low is better. So as you see, most of the populations have a low level of inbreeding. There were two exceptions. There was Suomenlinna, which is an island outside Helsinki city, which had a rather high level of inbreeding. And there is another island, Norte, in Åland Islands that also had a rather high level of inbreeding. So this is really good for us to know if we are to prioritize what populations to conserve. Maybe don't choose these two. We could also see that the populations are not genetically unique for themselves. We had this genetic differentiation, this FST value measures genetic differentiation between populations. And here 0 means no differentiation between populations, 1 means all the differentiation is between the populations. And we saw it range from 0.06 to 0.17, and this is quite low. We did a principal component analysis where all the individual samples were plotted on this two-dimensional scale. And as you can see, most of these intermix. So there is not a clear pattern based on this PCA. You see some Norwegian populations diversify a little bit, but not very much. And then we did something called admixture analysis. And this here in this one, I will explain it. So each bar here, there are many bars here. Each bar represents one individual, and these individuals are arranged according to the population they come from here. So these three are Icelandic, here is Fljótslid, here is another one, and here is another one. And then the colors represent genetic clusters. And the proportion of the color in each individual shows the proportion of diversity that is assigned to each cluster. So as you can see, this is 3 colors, 3 main clusters in the Nordic regions. And all populations shared at least 2 of the clusters, meaning there are no genetically unique populations. But then we looked at the geographic structuring of these genetic clusters. And then we could see that the clusters were actually grouping in an east-west structuring of genetic diversity. So we have the yellow cluster, that is Iceland and Denmark here. Then we have the blue pattern, which is Norway here. And here, this is northern Norway, it's quite far east, but it's still Norway. And then we have the red one here, Sweden, Åland, and Finland, and eastern Finland here. So there was a geographical clustering, the structuring of these clusters. And then we did something called phylogenetic clustering, where you could see that even though each individuals were sharing clusters, they mostly grouped together as populations here. And you could see that the main divider here in this phylogenetic clustering was between Western group, that is Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and an Eastern group, that is Finland, Åland, and Sweden. And this difference in clustering, we believe, is a pattern of a remnant of the recolonization after the last glacial period into the Nordic region, where plants moved in either from southwest or from the east. So this is kind of fits the book, these results that we could expect. So remnants of glacial recolonization. But then, as we know, here comes brännvin again, for you to wake up. There has been a lot of human intervention. Caraway is a crop that has been used as a garden plant and for medicinal properties. So it has a long history of cultivation, and we know humans have transported it to new locations. So the distribution of Carum carvi is both a result of natural spread since the last glaciation and human interventions. And here comes Iceland. So we know that historical records say that the caraway was introduced in the 17th century by Vísi-Gísli to Hlíðarendi in Fljótslid. And Hlíðarendi in Fljótslid is here. This is Sel in Skaftafell. This is Grænmýratungu in northwest. And we can see that the Icelandic and the Danish populations cluster together. And this sort of fits the story that the written sources said that he brought it from either Denmark or the Netherlands. We didn't have any samples from Netherlands in this study. Unfortunately, it would be interesting to include in a future one, but we see nevertheless that Icelandic and Danish samples group together. Furthermore, this is Fljótslid. These are the 2 other locations of the Icelandic samples. We can see that the diversity within each of these populations, it's highest in Fljótslid and it's lower in the other 2. So this is kind of a fun side effect of these genetic diversity studies, that these results are confirming the written sources of the introduction of caraway to Iceland and its further spread from Líðarendi to other parts of the country. Of course, we cannot say anything for sure, but according to this information, this is supporting the history of introduction. And then another thing, was there a human introduction of caraway into northern Norway? We had a very northern Norwegian population here up in Skjøtingsberg, and we found that it clustered together with more southern Norwegian populations from this area here. And this is quite far away, whereas the most geographically close population in Ålanka in Finland was not similar. So we can assume, based on this study, that humans from more southerly parts of Norway brought caraway up to the far north. This has not been natural migration, because then it would be more alike the Ålanka population in eastern Finland. So now I'm wrapping up. It's time to give some general conservation recommendations. So the aim, of course, is always to conserve as much genetic diversity as possible. We want to conserve many populations, many individuals, to maintain this long-term evolutionary capacity to adapt to natural selection and to new conditions in the light of climate change. But if we need to prioritize, we should base our prioritization on this informed knowledge that we can get from studies like this, and then we should select the populations with high genetic diversity, and we should include populations representing existing genetic clusters. And based on this study that we did, from these 16 populations, the recommendation was to conserve 4 of them. The Fljótslíð, the Vísi-Gísli population, had a high level of diversity and had a different clustering than Norway, and these populations in Åland and Finland. And then also this very northern population could be very interesting, because this northernmost distribution is likely to have a very extreme conditions. So we believe it has characters that other populations do not have. We recommend, of course, that species are conserved in nature, but it's always good to have a backup in gene banks. So seeds should preferably be sampled, and they have been sampled from these populations. And that makes the populations available for research and plant breeding. But also, if something happens in the future, if the populations goes extinct, we do still have the seeds, and we could use them for reintroductions. So time for a take-home message here. Species need to evolve in nature to adapt to climate change. That's pretty obvious. But not so obvious, because we are still destroying nature. So we need to think about that. We need to preserve enough nature that the species can evolve and also move when it needs, in the light of these new conditions that will come. And there is an urgency to collect these backup samples in gene banks for restoration purposes if natural populations goes extinct. But we also need this genetic diversity, these erfðalindir, to help adapt our crops and provide food security in the future. So we need to make these resources available for research and breeding via gene banks. And then these kind of genetic diversity studies, they enable informed decisions on conservation prioritizations. And I hope we can do more of these studies for different species. So thank you. Before I leave the floor open, I want to acknowledge that we were a lot of people doing these studies. It was led by Nordic and then Linköping University here, were the main driver behind these genetic diversity studies. I should mention that the next Rapna thing will be the 12th of November, and then we will have a guest from the US. It's Gary Griswold from White Memorial Conservation Center in Connecticut. She will be visiting Iceland, and she is an expert in bats, leðurblökur. So from caraway to leðurblökur, this will be a very interesting talk. So I hope you join us then. And now I think if any one of you have some questions, we do have a few minutes left. So just to write in the chat if you have any questions. No questions. I hope it was clear. All right, I think it's time to wrap it up. So I want to thank everybody who listened and hope to see you next time, 12th November. Thank you very much.